Hi everyone, welcome to your first video lecture. I am excited to share this content with you and I hope you find this a useful supplement to your reading and the other materials in our course. Now, just for the sake of the size of this file, you'll notice that I turn off my camera for most of the video, but you will see me pop up now and again. So I encourage you as you watch to take notes, jot down any questions that you have, and connect up with me anytime. Always here, and I hope you have a great first video lecture. So let's get started. So why are we here? What are we doing when we study economics? For most people, they think what we're doing is studying money, studying the stock market, maybe some finance. But the reality is that economics actually goes a lot deeper, and you can use it across industries, disciplines, and you don't have to even be interested in banking and finance to find economics deeply relevant for your life. And that is because what economics is really studying are the trade-offs and choices that people make. And we make our life choices under conditions of scarcity. We all want and need more things than we have the resources available to fulfill those wants and needs. And so because scarcity exists in our lives, every society, every organization, every company, every individual has to make choices and trade-offs, right? All of our choices are about exchange. What do we gain and what do we give up to get what we want? What is the opportunity cost as we choose one thing over another? So throughout our time together, I'm really going to push you to think about economics in a way that you maybe haven't before and consider the choices, exchanges, and trade-offs that we're making every day in all of the different aspects of our lives. So like any good introductory chapter, we need to set the context. We need the vocabulary, the language of economics to get us started. So what I want to do in these next few slides is give you that language so that you know how we're going to talk about things within the discipline of economics as we go through the semester. So let's talk first about the idea of goods. We talk about goods as all of or any of our products and services. And we break those goods down into two categories, right? Economic goods are things that we pay for, right? There's a monetary exchange of some value or the promise of money if you're paying by credit card in order to obtain those things. So there's a transaction that we have with a monetary exchange. Economic goods are also called scarce goods. And we will come back to this notion of scarce as we move through our chapters this semester. But then we also have free goods, right? And we want to talk about free in quotes here because in an economic sense, when we call something free, what we're saying is that there's a non-monetary trade-off. There is still a trade-off, but they are not requesting some sort of money in exchange. And the reason goods are considered free is because they are abundant enough, available enough, relative to the amount of people who want them, that there's no reason to charge for them. And we have some items that are essentially free, some items that are migrating and moving between being free and being economic. And we'll talk about those goods in those contexts. We also want to talk about what we call our factors of production, or the productive resources. And you'll hear me use that phrase resources a lot this semester. And that's because we just need a general catch-all term for the inputs that we use to make goods and services. And because we have unlimited goods that we can create and fabricate, right, stretched only by the power of our imaginations, we also just need a way to identify those resources into some subcategories. And the subcategories that we have are land, labor, economic or productive capital, and entrepreneurship. So let's talk about those in a little bit more detail. Let's begin with our human capital. Let's talk about labor. Labor are those folks that actually do the work, that are responsible for transforming inputs into goods. And we see that in our photo here. Typically, we don't have every individual person responsible for creating a product from start to finish. So what we do in terms of choices related to labor is we focus on the division of labor and the specialization of work tasks. Right? This makes our creation of goods and services more efficient because people can get really, really good at their tasks, and it makes it more effective when we can develop economies of scale. As we get better at our jobs, we get quicker, we get more productive. This means that we can spread the costs of creating goods out over more items, more units of production, and that gives us some economies of scale. So we'll be talking about labor as the folks who do the work of creating goods and services and transforming raw inputs into finished product. So now that we know the who, let's focus on the what, the where, and the how. Land is the big catch-all term for all of our raw materials that go into creating products. So here we have a series of straight pins and anything used to make those pins and to make the fabric that they are stuck into would be under the land resources. But because our folks are specializing in these different jobs, we know that we have to think about trade in our economic exchanges. So, for example, some folks are making those pins. They may or may not also be making the fabric that the pins are stuck into. And they almost certainly aren't making their own equipment. They might not be making the desks and the gloves that the workers use, the hammers that they make in order to make the pins. So we produce products using goods and materials that we've purchased from other producers. And that allows us to be really, really efficient and develop what we call the product markets. So we have our pin producers as an example. Seamstresses and tailors might purchase those pins Walmart might purchase them so that they can sell them to home sewers. And those exchanges facilitate other exchanges in the market as we all use our skills and abilities to generate our own income and then trade that income for the things we want and need. We call that series of exchanges the circular flow model, and it really does set the tone for every exchange we have, both for economic goods and free goods. And we actually saw during the 2020 pandemic lockdowns that this model works really well for describing and providing the foundation of our whole global economy. When it shut down, our economic lives literally shut down with it. And it wasn't until we kind of rebooted coming out a year later that we were able to see economic growth and productivity start back up. So let's look at these basic exchanges between households and firms. So top exchanges are in the product market, right? Let's go in that outer circle. Firms sell us goods and services, and we pay for goods and services with the result of our labor. It's a pretty straightforward process, right? Where do those funds come from? The inner circle. We give or sell, exchange our labor to companies, and they pay us benefits. So we're constantly moving. Think about your own payday, right? I go to work, I get a payday, I spend that money, I buy goods and services, right? That's our labor exchange, our labor market, and our product market on the outside. But then what's happening within the firm itself, right? This is where the transformation of our resources actually takes place. Inputs, raw materials, are being turned into outputs. They're being turned into outputs with equipment, right? That is our productive economic capital. And entrepreneurship is what creates the firm in the first place, right? That visionary leader who saw an opportunity and took the risk to start and run and maintain a business. So this provides us the important basic model of all economic exchanges that we have in our global society right now. So now let's get into the nitty-gritty of what we're doing this semester. Macroeconomics is one of two main branches in the study of economics as a discipline. Macro is about the big picture. Macro means broad and big. So we're going to be looking at large national and international issues such as economic growth, unemployment, inflation, and trade between states and nations. Microeconomics, which is its own course that I hope you'll all also investigate at some point in your academic careers, means small, means localized. And it's in micro that we focus on the actions of individual households, individual workers, individual businesses, and look at their choices as consumers and firms. What you'll notice if you take both courses is that these branches have a similar foundation. The circular flow model is inherent to both of them, for example, and we have some similar ideas around how supply and demand function, but then we see how those concepts and how problems generate at different levels of society within each sub-discipline. So we're focused big and broad this semester. And you can see here some similar but differently leveled questions, different levels of analysis from a macroeconomic context to a microeconomic context. So in the macro, we are going to be considering how governments, including the US, decide on a budget to serve the needs of their populations, how tax revenues should be collected and spent, and how much tax revenue to collect, what is an optimal level of growth to help society improve and help its citizens flourish, and how much specialization and trade should there actually be with other nations. On the microeconomic side, or more personal side, we would ask questions like, how do people decide whether and how much to work, or how much leisure to have? How do businesses decide what and how much to produce and how much to charge? How do they budget individually, and how do they save or spend their money? And what's the optimal way to fill all their wants and needs? So similar concepts, but very different levels of exploration. And so when we're talking about entire economies and we're cramming them into a very short period of time, there's no doubt that we have a lot to cover. And I just want to remind everybody that this is an introduction to a discipline, right? Economics as a field goes into so much more detail than we can possibly show here. So it might feel a little bit like you are drinking from a fire hose of information, and that's just to give you that broad context that should serve you well and help you be an informed citizen when you read the news, when you listen to news reports, or you're following along with our government officials at different levels. It's not the only course available to you, and I hope if you find it interesting, you'll branch out into other areas of economics and try more courses. But we're going to start with some shared foundations between macro and micro, specifically supply and demand, price controls, and elasticities. Then we'll get into the macro specific information where we measure growth and economic goals, talking about gross domestic product, GDP, employment, and inflation. And then we'll end our time together looking at macroeconomic policies and strategies, focusing on monetary policy, fiscal policy, and international trade and exchange. This is a social science. It crosses the quantitative with the qualitative. It crosses the math with the writing and the reading, and you'll use models, some quantitative analysis, and most importantly, critical assessment of data to inform your thinking and help support your ideas and decisions so that you can be more informed. By the end of this class, I really want you to feel confident that you can gather, read, and interpret basic economic data so that you can make choices about what you think and feel about what's happening in our society now and in the future. All right, let's switch gears. We've talked a little bit about what economics is going to be. Now let's make sure we're prepped. I mentioned quantitative analysis, and you do need some basics. Economics can get really, really complicated utilizing calculus, utilizing advanced statistics. For our purposes, we're not going that far. It is a 101 class after all, and we are just going to focus on some basics of algebra, basics of reading and interpreting math and data. So these next few slides are here to provide you with that critical reminder. And if you need some additional resources on that, definitely check out the textbook appendix, and a resource like Khan Academy is certainly useful to kind of revive those old skills if it's been a little bit and you need a little extra help. And of course, you can always reach out. But just some quick vocab. A function mathematically is just any relationship or expression of one or more variables. Variables are going to be the specific things that we're measuring. And in math, you are probably used to thinking of variables as letters. But what's important when you're doing and using variables in the real world is that those variables are standing for things in our life, right? So we want to know what's happening in our world and how different concepts and items in our world are related to each other. And so variables are just going to be stand-ins for amounts of things that we don't yet know or that we want to tweak and see what happens. Independent variables are the items that we would tweak or change. They vary when we're looking at conditions in the world. Right? These are often described as causes of things, or if this thing happens, right? These are the things that we change or that we tweak. A dependent variable is the item that we're going to watch to see what happens after the independent variables are changed, right? So we're looking for effects, or then this happens. So here are some examples. Let's see if we can identify the independent and dependent variable in each of these items. So what happens to ice cream sales when the temperature changes, or if the temperature changes? Right? In this example, the temperature is the thing that would change or vary, so that's your independent variable. The ice cream sales are the thing that we're watching to see what happens. That's your dependent variable. More recent to many of us, how are egg prices influenced by the recent outbreak of bird flu? Well, what changed? What varied? It was the outbreak of bird flu. So it was not there, then it grew, and then it lessened, right? So it went up and it went back down. That's your independent variable. The thing that we watched as an effect of that bird flu that we're wondering what happened to it, the egg price. That's your dependent variable. And then in an increasing macro context, what happens to the trade balance when tariffs are increased, right? That is a big picture concept between nations. It pops up in the news every now and again. So the tariff is the thing that changes. That's your independent variable. And the trade balance is the thing we're watching. That is your dependent variable. And mathematically, we often write the dependent variable first, but you don't have to, right? It can go either way. But remember to link variables to actual items. That's the power of quantitative data analysis and using these terms. A few basic math rules that you want to dust off and be able to use. First and foremost, this is an absolutely critical thing. Your order of operations absolutely matters. Much of what we'll be doing is basic math. You will have a calculator available to you, but order of operations is critical. So if you don't remember the PEMDAS or the order of operations, however you learned it, please take a moment, do a quick Google or AI search and review that information. We'll primarily be working with one dependent variable at a time. We won't have huge systems of complex equations or simultaneous equations for folks who have some more advanced math. We can only have one unknown for each equation, one thing that we're trying to solve for each equation that we have. So if there's more than one variable dependent that we want to investigate, we're going to have multiple equations. So you'll see that idea come back to you as we go through the semester. And there are two formulas that you absolutely want to remind yourselves of. We're going to be using a lot of linear formulas this semester. So the straight line formula, y equals mx plus b, where y is a dependent variable, x is an independent variable, b is an intercept where a straight line crosses the 0 axis on a graph, and m is a strength multiplier for x. Okay. We'll use those to draw a lot of basic straight lines, especially in our supply and demand chapter. You're looking at a basic precursor to the supply and demand curve here. And then we'll also be using the slope formula. Now, whether you learned that is the change in y or the difference in y divided by the difference in x, or rise over run, right? Slope gives us the angle of our lines and will tell us something about the relationship between the x and y variables. So dust off those formulas, revisit them, and be ready to use them as we go through the semester. Reading and interpreting graphical information is absolutely critical in economics. A lot of the data that is given to us is given in graph form because it is easier to interpret a picture than it is to go through dozens and dozens of columns of raw numbers. So you've got to get good and comfortable at looking at a picture and talking about what it means. So we have a little bit of interpretation to review on these next couple of slides. So let's talk about a linear or straight line relationship between two items that we would consider a positive or a direct relationship. And you can see that here. Positive relationships on graphs mean that as one variable gets bigger, so does the other variable. They go up and down together. So as the x number gets larger, the y number gets larger. A negative or an inverse relationship, in contrast, as one variable gets smaller, think about moving down, okay, the other variable is getting larger. So they act in opposition to each other. One goes up, one goes down, or the reverse. Okay. So we need to be able to look at the pattern of a data and know, first, do we see something that is generally positive or generally negative? Sometimes, though, we have absolutely no relationship whatsoever. Here we have a perfectly flat diagram. As the x changes, nothing happens. We could also have a perfectly vertical graph, right? As y changes, nothing happens to x. So if you've got perfectly flat or perfectly vertical data, you have no real relationship or a fixed relationship between the variables. We'll also take some time to explore some curved relationships. Now, each time we see a curve in a graph, that tells us that the equation for that curve has some sort of exponential feature in it. So one curve, like we see here, right, it's got a little bit of a curve, tells us there's a little bit of a squared term someplace in the formula that made this. If we see something that has multiple curves, we know we might have cubed terms or things raised to even higher powers. For our purposes, we are not actually creating those formulas. We're really just going to be looking at the graphs of them and talking about the relationships. So in this curve, non-linearly, what we see is a relationship that doesn't stay the same as x gets bigger, right? But a relationship that changes, that has different patterns as the x gets larger, right? First we see little changes in y, but then as it grows, the changes in y become even bigger and more pronounced. So we will have some linear straight line relationships and some curved nonlinear relationships. And here's just a little recap slide that I thought was useful enough to leave in from the chapter, just explaining some of those relationships and what we might see. So a zero slope is a horizontal line. A vertical line is sort of infinitely sloped by name. That's what the slope is called. Positive relationships have positive slopes. Negative lines have negative slopes. And if we have smaller intercepts, remember intercepts are just where it crosses the x or the y axis, then we will get just parallel lines, either bigger or smaller. And we'll do a lot of this interpretation as we go through our chapters. I just really want you to be ready. And so one final note about graphs. Here on your right, you see a pie chart, a bar chart, or excuse me, a column chart, and a line graph. Thing about those is that we always choose a graph based on the kind of information we have and being as clear as possible in our presentation. So you'll notice graphs throughout our book, throughout our notes, and in some of our live data that reflect the kind of information that we're looking at. And we'll get pretty good by the end of the semester at plotting different points ourselves. So here you see a data table showing the length of a baby and its weight, completely random, but good for plotting points. And they've got information for boys and girls, which they, of course, plotted as pinks and blues, but it does make it a little bit easier to see. And when we plot the points, they put the length on the x-axis, the weight on the y-axis, and then they just graphed those combinations of points. So the first dot, right, the boys and girls were so similar, they pretty much overlapped each other. This is the point 20 inches and approximately 8 pounds. And then they just went right down the list. There's 22 and 10.5. The babies stayed loosely the same, right? Considering the third point, 24 and either 13.5 or 13.2. And we just continue going. Each point, the x value and the y value. And we'll use this plotting skill pretty frequently throughout our semester, both in the drawing them ourselves and the interpreting of plots designed by others. And so that is it for our introduction to economics and economic thinking. I hope that you'll be able to use these quick review slides to make sure that your reading feels pretty complete, that your note-taking is complete, and that you feel prepared on the chapter that we discussed. And with that, I just want to say thank you for watching and participating, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Have a great day. Bye-bye.